With school back in session, parents may start to notice a little bit of fear rising in their child. Fears of maybe not making the team, not getting the A, or not being invited. It may circulate inside your kid's mind. My next guest says that if that fear of failure is not addressed in their childhood, it will very likely extend into adulthood. Studio 5 parenting contributor Heather Johnson is joining me with better ways to parent our fearful children. This ties into a phrase I was telling Heather during the commercial break that I sometimes feel a little skeptical about when it's applied or expressed by an adult, and that is fear of failure. It sometimes feels like an excuse.
It does, and oftentimes it is. We just don't realize we're using it that way. Remember, being afraid of failing is something that we might all feel, but when we take it too far or it starts to hinder our ability to function or we're using it as an excuse, we're going to hinder our growth, right? When it comes to our children, some doctors are actually calling this the new childhood epidemic because it is so widespread.
And I can see it with children. You think of their little minds in this big world. You think of all we're asking and ultimately expecting of them. Fear of failure makes sense to me as I consider it from a child's lens.
It does. It gets scary, right? And so we want to look at really where it's coming from first, kind of the root of it. And this fear of failure, especially in our children, and we feel it as adults too, comes from our popular culture. This idea that our popular culture has decided what success looks like and is very much tied to if you get the A, if you make the team, if you have the certain thing or look the certain way. And what we do is, as a culture, if we don't meet up to those things, we reject people who don't meet up to those standards. And so we put our kids in this position where if they don't do it right or accomplish it, they get rejected. Well, that is terrifying. That's terrifying. And so they're naturally going to want to fight against that all the time.
How are the ways children and adults maybe pull back from the possibility of failure?
Yeah, of that fear. One of the things they do is, kids especially, they're really good at just telling you they're not going to participate.
I'm not going to do it.
They just say, I'm not going to do it, right? I know for me, I work with youth a couple times a week. And so as we're interacting, oftentimes the youth will show up and we'll start to do things together. And without fail, there is a good handful that will refuse to participate. They won't kick the ball. They won't try the new thing. They won't have the conversation because they're so afraid of failing in it that they've just decided they're going to refuse to be involved at all. So that's one of the ways they do it. There's also a lot of excuses that are made up. And as parents, we can start looking at these things. If you have a child who's refusing to participate, it could be as a result of being afraid to fail and that anxiousness that comes with it. If you've got a child who's always making up excuses, well, I would have, but I was too tired, or I was going to try, except it made me too uncomfortable, which is a huge buzzword right now, right? That anyone can say, I'm uncomfortable, and all of a sudden,
hands off.
Nobody can touch them, right? And so those excuses are another way. And then there's the traditional that I think falls a little bit more to adults, or starts to, which is, in order to avoid failing, we just make sure we always succeed. And so we have kids who are constantly making sure that they do it all right. And then we become adults that are like, well, I cannot fail, which means if I'm always succeeding, I don't ever have to be afraid of the failure.
Really wise observations, and I think points that will have us thinking about this topic in a new light. How can we press forward to some solutions? You believe it begins with redefining the word failure.
It is. We have to start there. We see failure as bad. Failure is not bad. Failure is another step, just like a success, on being human. It's on this path.
We say this, but it doesn't feel good. You know, it doesn't feel good.
Right, it doesn't, and we don't love it. And also, we learn from it, we grow from it, we can do something with it. But the only reason it doesn't feel good is because we've decided as a society that failure is bad. Who decided it was bad? Why can't it be just like the acronym sometimes is said, that it's just a first attempt at learning? Why can't fail just be, this is my first attempt at learning this, right? So now you have a child who goes out for the tennis team and doesn't make it, or doesn't make the team they wanted. How awesome, that's a first attempt at learning tennis, right? Or you tackled a spelling test, or you applied for colleges. This is our first attempt at doing this. And that's what failure is. We're only uncomfortable because we've decided it's bad.
How can we then not just make it comfortable, but make it an option? Like it's on the menu at our house, in our family, in this life pursuit of stretch and growth. It's an option.
It has to be an option. Why? Because we will fail. There is no way around this. Any of us who think we won't fail, or that we can raise children who never deal with failure, we are kidding ourselves. So our kids have to know by our words and our actions that failure is always an option. One of the best ways to do this is to make sure that when they fail, they're accepted, that there is no change in the way we treat, love, wrap our arms around, work with. right? Because as soon as we treat them in a way different when they fail, now they decide, ooh, that wasn't an option.
I love that you've pushed us past words, because we're always going to say, I love you no matter what. I love you, good choice or bad. But you're saying our actions have to model that. What are some subtle actions we could, demonstrate or show or put into motion that will communicate what you just described?
Well, sometimes it's actually the other way. It's the actions that we do that communicate the other way, the wrong way, right?
Okay.
Where all of a sudden a child comes home and there's been a failure and we say, well, did you study? Well, did you go back and ask the teacher if you could get any extra points? Did you work your hardest? Did you? And all of a sudden they're sitting there going, oh my gosh, number one, no one understands what I feel like right now.
Yeah.
And number two, they've already told me that the fact that I came home with this outcome means that I'm worth less.
It's not okay.
Remember, this attacks a self-worth place. That's what failure does. And so when that rejection tackles a self-worth and it's based on those outcomes, we all of a sudden question if we're enough.
You want us to help our children fail forward, and I don't even know what that means, but I love the sound of it.
Yeah, it's the understanding that when we have a failure, we're going to use it to move forward. We're going to productively look at the failure and decide what it can mean for our future. Remember, we do the same thing with successes, do we not? We look at a time when we've succeeded, and we look at it and say, okay, what can I learn from this to duplicate it or to learn from it or to grow with it?
Yeah.
Failure's the exact same way. Let's look at it and fall forward with it. Great, let's take it with us. There's a million things I do different today as a result of failing in the past, where we grow. So you want a very common phrase to be in your home. Hey, we fail forward, which means we hear it, we experience it, and we're gonna be productive in what we're gonna do with it.
And that failure, you say, can be, should be, has to be part of our teaching culture as parents.
As parents, right? This idea that we wanna hide from our kids when we've failed, it's really unfortunate. It's okay for them to know. In fact, it's imperative for them to know that we failed. More importantly, we've got to wrap it up with the bow that shows them that we fail forward too. So it isn't just I've made the mistake or I didn't make the team or hey, I didn't get into the school because I didn't work hard enough my junior year. It's not that. It's explaining those situations and saying, and here's what I learned and what I do as a result of it now. We've got to teach with failure, just like we teach with success. I mean, don't we hear those stories? I immediately think of how many times we've talked about Michael Jordan in our home. Right?
Yeah.
We know those very classic stories. Make them ours. I have plenty of failure stories. I want our kids to know those things, but I more importantly want them to know what I've done as a result of the failure so that it's no longer bad. It changes the culture in our home.
Beautifully said, and it's not out there. It's not a Michael Jordan story. It's our story.
It's ours.
I love
It's
that
ours.
so much, Heather. Thank you. Heather has a private practice where she coaches families, individuals, couples too. You can find her contact information on our website.